we think of as goodness. Human rights are a good thing, right? But if you look at the history of ideas, you'll find that all of these things have come to us, whether we identify as Christians or not in this room today. All of these ideas have come to us from Christianity. Now you might say, well, you're a Christian. Of course you'd say that. You want to claim like everything good for Christianity. So let's listen to a couple of non-Christian historians. A guy named Yuval Noah Harari, who's an atheist Israeli historian, who wrote this best-selling book called Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind. Has anyone read it? Oh, it's a fun book. I mean, I don't agree with much of it, but it's interesting. He says, talking about human rights, Homo sapiens have no natural rights, just as spiders, hyenas, and chimpanzees have no natural rights. He says that human rights are a figment of our fertile imagination. He says that the scientific study of Homo sapiens has embarrassingly little to do with the idea of unique human worth and value. So where do these ideas come from? He says from Christianity. He quotes the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. He says the Americans got the idea of equality from Christianity, but if we stop believing in the Christian myths about God creating humans in his own image, then what does it even mean to say that human beings are equal? I think of one of my fellow countrymen, a historian named Tom Holland. He wrote this very fat, very interesting, but probably longer than you have time to read, book called Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. And he wrote this book not as a Christian himself. He had stopped believing in God, or at least in the Christian God, when he was a kid. He found the Greek and Roman gods much more attractive than the sort of pathetic hero of Christianity. But in the course of writing this book, this history of Christianity in the West over the last 2,000 years, Tom Holland came to the conclusion that so many things that you and I, whether we're Christians or atheists or Hindus or Buddhists living in the West today, things that we think of as self-evident truths are in fact specifically Christian beliefs. And that without Christianity, they are not fundamentally philosophically grounded. So Christianity defines goodness. Now this problem of atheism not actually supporting our deep beliefs in human equality and value and love across difference and care for the poor dawned gradually for one of the few people who knew both me and my husband when we were both graduate students at Cambridge University. So a friend of mine named Sarah Irving Stonebreaker, who's now a history professor in Australia, where she comes from. Sarah was a convinced atheist when she came to Cambridge to do her PhD, which is where I met her. She was a convinced atheist when she went to Oxford to do her postdoc. While she was at Oxford, she went to a series of lectures by a fellow Australian, a Princeton philosophy professor named Peter Singer. And Singer is one of the atheist philosophers who stares in the face the reality that we can't just trade on Christian equality anymore. And he says that rather than saying that humans should be valued equally because we're human, that instead we should evaluate beings, human or otherwise, according to their capacities. For example, their capacity to suffer, their capacity for self-awareness, etc. And according to Peter Singer's calculation, a human infant is less morally valuable than an adult pig. Now, as my friend Sarah heard these lectures, she felt what she later described as a sort of intellectual vertigo, where she realized that far from supporting her deepest moral beliefs, how atheism actually stuck a knife in their back. And she had thought that Christianity was the enemy of care for the poor and justice for the weak and the oppressed, and equality for men and women, and love across racial difference. But she gradually discovered it was the basis for those things. And so she ended up putting her trust in Jesus. So that's our third point. Christianity defines goodness. And our last and potentially most controversial point is that Christianity might just be true. Now, 40 years ago, if you'd asked any sociologist of religion what was going to happen globally when it came to religious belief in the coming years. They would have told you that as the world became more modern, more educated, more scientific, that religious belief would naturally decline. It's what had happened in Western Europe, where I'm from. And so the argument went, where Western Europe leads, the rest of the world must follow, right? Wrong. In the 40 years since then, not only has religious belief failed to decline globally as the world's become more modern, more educated, more scientific, but actually, as experts now look out over the next 40 years, they're anticipating an increasingly religious world. So right now, Christianity is the largest belief system in the world, with about 31% of humans identifying as Christians. By 2060, that proportion is set to increase slightly to 32%. Christianity is also, by the way, by far the most diverse belief system in terms of race and culture and geography. Islam is the second largest belief system in the world. About 25% of the world identifies as Muslim. That proportion is set to increase significantly by 2060 to about 31%, so making it a very close competitor with Christianity. Buddhism and Hinduism are both expected to decline slightly in that period. And here's the real shock. The proportion of people who have no specific religious beliefs, so whether they are atheists, agnostics, or whether they just sort of check none on the census form and ask what your religion was, that proportion is set to decline globally from 16% to 13%. So the tide isn't going out of religion, it's coming in. It's especially interesting what's happening in China at the moment. So China today is the global center of atheism. The experts predict that there will be more Christians in China than in America in the next 5 years. And some experts even think that China could be a majority Christian country by 2060. Now, what are the implications of this for how we should think in the Western world in general and the academic world in particular? There's a professor named Fan Gangyang, who's a leading expert of sociology of religion in China. And he makes this observation. He says that in the university academic world in the West, the failure of the secularization hypothesis, the failure of this idea that as the world modernized, it would become less religious, has been very much proven, but it hasn't really come home to roost. You see, in the Western academy in recent decades, the idea that the world is becoming less religious has functioned not just as a diagnosis, but as a prescription. So it's not just what people thought would happen, but it's what they thought should happen. So what are Western academics going to do when they realize that it hasn't happened? And that atheism, far from being the belief system of diversity and progress, is actually the belief system of white Western men and communist regimes. Fan Gangyang says that there is going to have to be a paradigm shift in the university, much like a scientific revolution, when the failure of the secularization hypothesis is properly grasped in the Western academy. Now, you guys are much too smart to think that just because a lot of people believe something, it must be true, right? People believe all sorts of stupid things. But it should give us pause before we dismiss Christianity to recognize that rather than just being something that's naturally declining as people become smarter and more educated, that actually the reverse is happening. I'm not going to talk a lot about science because you've had much more expert folks on science speak in recent weeks. But there's a professor at Princeton University called Hans Halvorsen. He's one of the top 4 philosophers of science in the world. And he explained to me that it's not only the case that the modern scientific method was first developed by Christians because they believed in a creator God, but that actually even today, science rests much more firmly on theistic foundations than on atheistic. In fact, he says that atheism doesn't give you a philosophical foundation for science at all. So let's review just for a second. If we look at Christianity, we find the belief system that has taught all of us that human beings are fundamentally morally equal, that men and women are fundamentally equal, that love across racial difference is in fact a good thing, that people starving in the slums in Calcutta can make moral demands on us here now. If we look at Christianity, we find the religion that spawned the scientific revolution. If we look at Christianity, we find the most diverse and widespread belief system in the world. So the question is, could it possibly be true? That is a question you guys are going to have to explore much more thoroughly than we can cover tonight. But just before I end, I want to refresh your minds or introduce you to the basic beliefs of Christianity. So number one, Christians believe that there is a creator God. That's not an alternative hypothesis to science. It's a belief on which the scientific method was first developed. But more crazily, Christians believe that that creator God knows your name, has counted every single hair on your head, and loves you literally to death. Christians believe that none of us deserve that love. In fact, all of us have turned our back on God. All of us justly deserve God's condemnation. But that in the person of Jesus, God's only Son, that he stepped in. And when he died on the cross, he took that judgment for us. What's more, Christians believe that Jesus was raised from the dead 3 days later, just as I told my Jewish atheist friend at Harvard. Totally crazy belief. And that one day, if we put our trust in Jesus, he will raise us from the dead as well. And as a Christian, I believe that how we respond to Jesus is the most important decision anyone in this room will ever make. Are we better off without Christianity? The real question is, are we better off without Jesus? And I'm more sure about this than about anything else in my entire life. The answer to that question is no. I've said a lot of things. I've made a lot of wild, quick claims. The book that I wrote, some of the copies of it are at the back, has a lot of footnotes that will substantiate some of these wild claims. And I'd love to give you a copy if you're interested. But I would also love at this point to just hear your questions. Fine if you want to write them on Slido. I actually love just talking with people in the flesh, as it were. So if people feel comfortable shouting out their question, maybe into a microphone, that would be even better.
So much, first of all. If you want to give a hand to Dr. McLaughlin for that talk, that was wonderful. Thank you. So moving into Q&A, just the logistics on how this works again is if you like to ask a question in person, just raise your hand and we'll bring around a mic for you to ask your question. And then if you feel more comfortable posing it anonymously, you can put it on the Slido with the link that is on all of the tables. So yeah, does anyone have a question? Okay, I'll start with the one that's on Slido then. So the one that comes up here is, can't we arrive at the conclusion that everyone should be treated equally because it's more beneficial to society overall? And why do we need Christianity for this?
Yeah, good and interesting question. And a couple of things I'd want to say on that. Number one, my point is not that you cannot choose to abide by fundamental Christian ethics without believing in Christianity. You can. But it is ultimately a somewhat arbitrary choice. And the assumption in the question that if it's better off for all if we act like this may well be true, but the assumption is that you should care what's best for everybody rather than just what's best for you. And it's actually a very sort of basic human instinct for us to care for ourselves, for our family, for our tribe. What our tribe looks like may or may not be our sort of literal biological group. At this point, we sort of operate in tribes in a more complicated way. But there's no actual sort of fundamental reason why you should seek to benefit another tribe, another person's tribe, perhaps even an enemy, when you could be benefiting yours more. One of the most radical things that Jesus taught was that we should love our neighbor as ourselves. And he defined neighbor as your hated racial and religious enemy. He told a story called the Parable of the Good Samaritan, very famous story, which doesn't really hit us today because we don't think of Samaritans as our most hated enemy. But at the time that Jesus was speaking, people did. And so this fundamental idea that we should recognize the basic equality and our duty to actively love, not just to sort of tolerate or allow it to exist, but to actively love and be willing to sacrifice for people utterly different from us, is a fundamentally Christian idea. And yeah, so it seems, and Tom Holland, the British historian I mentioned, is very interesting on this. He says, it's really hard for us to get our minds around the fact that we, whether we're Christians or not, have deeply ingested Christian ethics, to where it seems just like, well, of course, you'd want to do the thing that was best for everyone, rather than the thing that was just best for you and your tribe. Like there's something deep in us that resonates with that. But that wasn't what the Greeks and Romans thought. If you look back through history, you see that sort of idea catches on as Christianity progresses around the world.
Great, thank you. So anyone in person have a question? Otherwise, I'll go to Slido. Okay, the next one on Slido is, let's see. Could you explain more about your statement that science has a better philosophical foundation in theism than atheism?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so this, again, this guy, Hans Halvorsen, is super interesting on this. So he says that the reason that folks started thinking in modern scientific ways was because they figured that if there is a creator God who is God of all the universe and made everything, and if he's the kind of God we see in the Bible who has a consistent character and reveals his character according to consistent laws, then maybe if we start looking at nature, we'll find underlying laws that we humans made in God's image can discern. And so the project of science is sort of looking for those principles. And one of the other sort of basic beliefs of the Bible is that this creator God is completely free. So he could have made the universe in any way he chose. So the only way for us to find out how he did in fact make the universe is to go and look. That's sort of basic project of science, looking for those underlying consistent principles, expecting the universe to be consistent rather than just like, if there's one God who's in charge over here and another one in charge over here, another one in charge over there, you wouldn't necessarily expect consistency across the board, right? So a couple of problems philosophically with science from an atheist perspective. One is you don't have this idea that there is a sort of intelligence behind the universe that might have created the universe according to these laws and principles. The other problem is you're only an ape with sort of evolutionarily developed brain. You have no real reason to think that the neurons firing in your brain could have any connection to what's happening in the universe out there. So the Christian idea, the Jewish Christian idea, I should say, that we're actually made in the image of the creator God, makes sense of the fact that we humans are able to sort of, as one pioneering Christian physicist said, think God's thoughts after him. So Hans Halvorsen says, it's not that atheists can't do great science. Like many great scientists are atheists, right? But from a philosophical point of view, as an atheist, you just sort of have to say, well, aren't we lucky that science works? They really have a sort of deep reason to believe that it should. Yay, thank you. In-person question, I love it. Tell me your name. Oh, and actually, I think Chris is going to bring you a microphone. I love talking to real people. Not that those weren't real people, I'm sure, but like people I can see.
Thank you for the talk. The thoughts what you were saying about thoughts, though, could you argue that, like, from an evolutionary standpoint, like, I guess, like, kind of just like, I guess, like, a discussion that, like, we're able to think the way we do, and to, like, I guess it would be like someone having like primitive thoughts and then like those being good and like.
Yeah, so great question. So for sure, we can see how humans, for example, like started growing really big brains that just had the capacity to do complicated things they couldn't do before. And we know that humans are good, even historically in our evolutionary past, we're kind of good at like figuring stuff out because there's an advantage to figuring stuff out. And that's kind of what's led us to being in the place where we are today. So it's not that we couldn't sort of develop our minds in that direction. But even posing that question raises an interesting related question, which was addressed very memorably by one of your own faculty here, a guy named Alan Meitman, who I think is still a professor of physics and literature here, certainly was a few years ago. He was at an event at MIT describing what a human being is. And he said this, our consciousness and our self-awareness create the illusion that we have made of some sort of special substance, that we have some ego power, some I-ness, some unique existence, when in reality we are nothing but bones, tissues, gelatinous membranes, electrical impulses, and chemicals. He went on to say, we are stuffed like donuts. So if we take a sort of scientifically atheist perspective, strip out any kind of belief in God or any extra understanding of what a human being might be beyond what we can study scientifically, we end up having a really hard time even concluding that you and I are sort of unique, real agents. Sam Harris relatedly says that the idea that human beings are deeply responsible for our mental states and subsequent behavior is simply impossible to map onto reality. So there's sort of the question of if we strip away any kind of religious understanding of what a human being is, not only do we have problems around our philosophical basis for science, we also have problems around, are we even a unique, coherent being that could be engaging in science or could be engaging in moral decisions. All sorts of things start to unravel when we sort of peel off that religious layer of understanding, in addition to how we might approach scientific questions.
Great, thank you. Anyone else in person have a question? If not, we have something that's,
here we go. Oh, I don't mean the mics. Yeah.
So on your first and second point, you mentioned that Christianity is good for universals. You mentioned a lot of different statistics there about how Christianity is correlated with a lot of good ones, is that correct? But in the case, like, is there a differentiation between the correlation versus the causation?
Yeah, good question. So I leave the real scholarship on these questions to folks like Tyler Vandervelde who actually know what they're talking about. I'm an expert in almost nothing, but I know a lot of experts in a lot of things. So he's done a lot of work in terms of making sure that they're looking at real phenomena, not just sort of accidental phenomena. Now, crackly there. So to some extent, nobody's quite sure why there is this correlation. So some people say, well, it must be just the sort of social interactions that you would get from regular religious participation. And the studies that have been done in the US, the vast majority of participants have been Christians, but it's actually like you could go to a synagogue on a Saturday every week as well and see similar kinds of effects. But it does seem to be phenomena that are limited to religious participation. You couldn't just go to the golf club and do the same like every Saturday and meet the same people to do the same thing. That accounts for only about 30% of the benefits that seem to arise from religious participation in particular. You could look at Tyler Vandervelde's papers to sort of dig into the minutiae and that, but he, and it's not just him, I mean, his research group and then others in other universities have been doing similar kinds of studies just to show that there's a heck of a lot of correlation. And they obviously control for things like, if they're looking at levels of depression, they make sure that they're controlling for sort of baseline depression when they're comparing things. They do all the things that you good scientists do.
I'm going to ask a question off of Slido just because there's one that's got a lot of votes. And also remember, if you just want to go in and check out the questions and upvote them, you can do that just by going to the link. But the top one right now says, I'd argue affirming LGBTQ people is good, but modern versions of the Bible state homosexuality is sin, leading to much pain and alienation. How does this fit?
Yeah, really important question. So personal side note, just before I answer this question, I've been a Christian for as long as I can remember. I've also been attracted to women for as long as I can remember. So this is a question that's quite personal for me. And it's a question which is, if I had examined the Bible carefully and found that it in fact affirmed, for example, same-sex marriage for Christians, I would have been quite pleased by this news. So I'm not someone who's sort of come to the Bible hoping to find that it doesn't affirm same-sex marriage for believers. Quite the opposite. But the more that I've studied the Bible over the years, the more convinced I've become of a couple of things. One is that the Bible is actually extremely restrictive when it comes to sexual ethics, in a way that it feels shocking to us today. It was honestly even more shocking in the Greco-Roman Empire into which Christianity was born. The idea that every Christian should either be faithfully married to somebody of their opposite sex or celibate, not having sex with anybody, would have sounded completely outrageous to a first century Greek or Roman man. Because sure, women were expected to be faithful to one husband, but men could sleep with anyone they liked. And in that cultural context, the question was less, are you sleeping with another man or with a woman? The question was like, who is penetrating who? And it was a signal of dominance, essentially. So the Bible, the New Testament, was written in the context of a world where Christian sexual ethics would have seemed very strange and bizarrely narrow. I think they seem similarly strange today, slightly different reasons. So the first thing I've become more and more sure of is that the Bible is actually clear on this question, hard as that's been for me to hear at times in my life. The second thing I've become more and more clear on is that Christian sexual ethics is actually weirder than you might even think. It's all based on this incredible vision in the Bible of Jesus' relationship with his church. Now, folks in this room might be familiar with the fact that the Bible calls God our Father. And so human fathers at their very best gives a tiny glimpse of God's love for us. And that's sort of why God even designed human fathers. The Bible also gives that picture of mothers, and mothering metaphors are used of God in the Bible. So the absolute best human mother gives us a tiny glimpse of God's nurturing motherly love for us. But the massive metaphor of Jesus' relationship with his church is what Christian marriage hangs on. And it's a love across difference. It's a love built on sacrifice. It's a flesh-uniting, life-creating, never-ending, exclusive love. That is what Christian marriage is about. It's actually not. So my marriage to my husband, from a Christian perspective, it's not mostly about him and me making each other happy. It's not mostly about us having a home to raise children in. Both of those things are good things. But it's fundamentally about us being like a little scale model of Jesus' love for his church. So any conversation that we could have around Christian sexual ethics, that really is at the center of it. I think too often, sadly, people only have these conversations sort of without that central vision of Jesus' love for us. And here's something that I will tell you, and I have actually a number of friends who would testify to the same thing, having made similar decisions to me. Jesus' love is better than anybody else's. And it is always worth sacrificing your sexual or romantic fulfillment for a better love.
Thank you. Do we have an in-person question? Okay, I will switch to Slido then. There's another highly upvoted one. Sort of maybe going off of this theme of love. How can Christians claim that God is loving if they also believe God sends people who've never heard of Jesus to hell?
This is so, my first book, Confronting Christianity, the subtitle is 12 Hard Questions for the World's Largest Religion. The last question is, how can a loving God send people to hell? And honestly, I think it is the only really hard question in the book. All the other questions, like the hardest questions that you could ask about sexuality or about suffering or about science or about any of these things, actually pale in significance compared to this question. And it seems for many, especially folks outside the Christian faith, it seems like the Christian message is sort of arbitrary and cruel. So, you're telling me that if I just randomly believe in this dude who died 2,000 years ago, my sins are forgiven, and I get sort of sorted into heaven one day. And if I don't, I get sorted into hell. It seems like this sort of arbitrary, unfair thing, right? If you look at what Jesus says about himself, you find a couple of very interesting things. One, you find Jesus is more loving and compassionate than anyone you've ever met. If you open up one of the Gospels and read through, you will find extraordinary love and compassion. You'll also find that Jesus warns more of God's judgment than basically anyone else in the Bible, takes it very seriously. And he says of himself, things like this. He says, I am the light of the world. He says, I am the bread of life. He calls himself living water. He says he is the way, the truth, and the life. Now flip all of those around. If Jesus is the light of the world, then being without Jesus means being in utter darkness. If Jesus is the bread of life, then being without Jesus means being desperately hungry. If Jesus is the living water, then being without Jesus means dying of thirst. If Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, being without Jesus means being eternally lost. And here's the crazy claim at the heart of Christianity, is that being with Jesus is in fact heaven. It's not that God sends you to a place because you happen to have put your trust in Jesus. It's that Jesus is the heaven. Jesus, the person of Jesus, is heaven. And that's again why human marriage at its very best gives us a tiny little picture. We listen to pop songs all day long talking about romantic relationships as if they're heavenly, right? You listen to Adele or Taylor Swift or whatever, you start thinking, well, gosh, they must have some great romantic life. No human romance is going to sustain the kind of experience of heaven that these songs point us to. But Jesus claims that he is. So the injustice, or the idea that God is unjust for sending people away from Jesus who have not turned to Jesus, do you see how it's actually more logical than that? If we not trusted in Jesus, then we don't get Jesus. The implications of not getting Jesus are terrible. Now, what about those who've never heard? I think that was part of the question there. I think it's a more complicated question from a scriptural perspective. It's certainly very clear that anyone who has heard and had the opportunity to put their trust in Jesus is very clear that we will be held responsible for our decisions there. It's absolutely clear in the Bible that nobody will ever enter God's presence without their sins having been paid by Jesus on the cross. Now, clearly, many people, in fact, before Jesus was born, were trusting in God, and their sins were ultimately paid for by Jesus on the cross. Could there be a way that people who have never heard of Jesus could have similar trust? I don't know. But certainly it's only through the cross that anyone is saved from a Christian perspective. And just last comment on that, which is not sort of happy thought to end on. But our basic assumption is that we human beings are all sort of fundamentally morally good, like maybe we have some blemishes here and there. But if there is a God, then he would certainly be pleased with you and me, right? Actually, the Bible paints a much less flattering picture of what we human beings are. So the surprise is not that God would ever send anybody away from himself. The surprise is that God would love us so much to come to us and to lift us up towards him. And I don't know whether you're someone who kind of naturally thinks of yourself as like probably a bad person or probably a good person, but I'd invite you to do a little thought experiment. Imagine that your thoughts were projected onto a screen like this behind your head all the time. Like imagine now, suddenly your thoughts are up there with your name, yeah? So all the mean things you've thought about me in the last half hour, they're like right up there for everyone to see. But for me, that prospect would be utterly horrifying. Like I would run out of this room right now. I would hide in my room and never see anybody, because it's not that all my thoughts are bad all the time, but enough of them are that it would ruin all my relationships if people actually saw my thoughts. I'm fundamentally not a good person. But the shock of Christianity is the one person who does see my thoughts, knows me better than I know myself, also loved me enough to die for me.
Great, thank you. In-person questions.
My friend.
Thank you very much. So I'm thinking of it like the way you talk about Christianity. Christianity is more like the roots, which the good things like the good justice, the concept life. But then it was returning to read the Bible, and the Bible has its own advantages. And then I kind of have thinking that it's Christianity not something more like that evolved as human beings evolved. So it's more like there's a culture and then they take a good part of this culture and then it's the religion. Because like the Old Testament, when Moses says an eye for an eye, now we would say that's in Christianity because maybe as human beings get more civilized, the family will better maybe the farm for even someone for and we have the more reasonable thing to do that and revenge. So it's Christianity more like just kind of putting people at bay and preventing us from being chaotic and really like things that actually happen because now, so for example, now I think the way we interpret the Bible, some people actually believe that the 107 days, but that it replaces all of them, like, so it depends on how it's actually being used or how like the ability because you try to reform your mindset of the goals and stuff. So I think it's not like the way of people like so maybe to colonize Africa, you just tell them, hey, be love kind of maybe show love to your neighbors, kind, those that will not kind of be vote against you and say that now you and that's what's came for or it's really true.
Gosh, I'm hearing about 4 different really good questions rolled into that. So I'll do my best to address at least some of them. So I think the question you started with, which was very interesting, was how do we know that Christianity, like which is the cart and which is the horse, right? So I've kind of been talking like Christianity is the horse and the ways that we think morally in the cart. I'm just now going to dance across the stage because it's silly. You're saying, well, wait a minute, what if it's just more that human beings are kind of grown up a bit over time, and it was more like culture was the horse and Christianity was sort of the cart. Is that a fair summary of what you were saying in the first part of your question? Yeah. So good question. What you need to do is look back, and Tom Holland's book Dominion, it's very fat, but it will address this very clearly. Look at the history. So what's actually quite clear historically is that the movement that Jesus started was the thing that sparked off this moral revolution. It wasn't that there was a moral revolution sort of gradually happening and Jesus came along and sort of jumped on board. what he was saying was completely radical in the world into which he was speaking. The idea, and even if we look back at things that happen in the Old Testament, the reason, for example, that we think today that genocide is wrong is not because that's a self-evident truth. Actually, the Greeks and the Romans were like, great, you won, you beat this other country, great, like kill as many of them as you want, enslave the rest. Like, people are only going to be impressed by you for that. It's the sort of thing that a Roman emperor would boast about. It wasn't like morally shameful. So how did it suddenly become morally shameful? Well, it was all Jesus' fault. Saying, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Saying that you should love, I mentioned the parable of the Good Samaritan earlier, this story that he tells in response to the question, who is my neighbor? When he's just taught you have to love your neighbor as yourself. And he tells this shocking story about a Samaritan man picking up a Jewish man who's been beaten and left for dead on the road. So if we look historically, we see that actually it is specifically Christianity that started this moral revolution. I think you had a question as well about, well, how do we know that the Bible is basically made up? And I think we need to look at different sections of the Bible from different perspectives and through different lenses to understand what we need to take from them. But I'm just going to talk for a second about Jesus himself. The historical evidence for Jesus of Nazareth is extremely strong. I mean, as a historical figure, everyone from atheists to evangelical Christians who are scholars in this area will tell you that Jesus existed as a real human being in history, that he was claimed to be the Messiah, that he died on a cross, that his followers subsequently worshipped him as a god. Like all of this is verified even outside the Gospels, the 4 accounts of his life in the Bible. And then if you look at the Gospels themselves, you find an extraordinary level of specific geographical, historical, and cultural detail pertaining to the particular area of the world, sort of first century Galilee and Judea, in which Jesus was operating. And you find those documents written down well within the lifetime of eyewitnesses to the events of Jesus' life. So we're talking, when we look at the gospel accounts of Jesus' life, we're talking about very concrete sort of historical claims. Now, could his followers have been crazy to believe that he was raised from the dead? Like, sure. But there are multiple eyewitnesses claiming that he had been. So we can't just sort of dismiss the Bible as, a mythology that was made up a long time ago, because the person of Jesus kind of won't let us do that. I know you had 3 or 4 other questions in the mix there, but I don't properly remember. So I'm gonna stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for your series of questions. I'm going to ask this one on Slido just because it has a lot of votes.
Yeah.
What's your take on the Islamic faith growing significantly faster globally than Christianity by 2060? Shouldn't we give Islam the same / more attention in that case?
Yeah, I think in the West, we tend to give Islam less attention and sometimes the sort of wrong kind of attention, I guess I would say. For my generation, certainly, the question seemed to be, is religion dying out, or how fast will religion die out? The question today, really globally, is Christianity or Islam? Now, whether or not you are a Christian here today, again, going back to sort of what we were talking about these sort of core moral beliefs that have been spread by Christianity across people of different beliefs, across people who today would hold different beliefs but have sort of been infected by all this Christian ways of thinking. That predisposes us now to look at least some of the teachings of Islam and not be drawn to them. So, for example, if we look at the teachings when it comes to women within Islam, my guess is that if you and I, whether you identify as an atheist or an agnostic or sort of not sure what you believe today, if we sort of sat down and did a point-by-point comparison of Christianity versus Islam when it comes to some of our moral beliefs, I think we would find that Christianity is more attractive, let's say. Why is Islam growing so fast? Partly the same reason that Christianity is growing, and that's that religious people have a lot more children. But it's not only that, as I mentioned in China, there's this sort of quiet revolution happening of people who have been raised with communist atheism, finding that Christianity is meeting their deepest needs in a way that their atheism didn't. What's interesting as well, just connected to that, Christianity has always been a majority female religion. We can see that from the earliest records we have of the percentages or the proportions of men and women in the church. We can see it from the way that Christians were laughed at in the 2nd century, as mocked as a religion of women and slaves and little children. And we see it today in China, for example, about twice as many women in the church as men. If you're a member of a church here today, you'll probably look around on a Sunday morning and be like, oh yeah, more women than men. It's not new. So how Christianity treats women and values women does, I think, set it apart from Islam. But it is also the case that there's a strong emphasis on Muslim women having a lot of children, so that there's that sort of compensation happening there.
Great, thank you. We have time probably for one more question. So if someone wants to ask in person, feel free to do that. Otherwise, I'll go to Slido. Okay. Last question from Slido. I'm going to just scroll through these real quick. So this one asks, other religions offer the same kind of moral correction that Christianity does. Why does it matter what religion a person follows so long as no harm is done?
Yeah, I think that is something that we tend to believe for two reasons. One, because if you talk with a Hindu friend, for example, here in our sort of culture here, or if you talk with a Muslim friend, you will likely find that they share many of your core moral beliefs. That is not necessarily because that is what their religion of origin has always taught. It's actually, as I mentioned earlier, it's something that Tom Holland goes into in his book. It's a way in which Christian thinking has infected even other countries with other majority religions. So it's not actually necessarily the case that all religions are teaching basically the same thing when it comes to ethics. Now, it's true that in almost any sort of philosophical system, religious or otherwise, you have some kind of idea of reciprocity. So people will say, well, when Jesus said, treat others as you have them treat you, like you can find that in any, pick your philosophy, pick your religion, you'll find that there. That's only half true. Because the real question is, who are those other people? Is this a philosophy or is this a religious conception where the other people you're meant to treat in that reciprocal way are other freeborn men, for example? Whereas if people are in a different, like people are women, or if people are from a different tribe than yours of one sort or another, you can treat them very differently. The radical sort of ethical innovation of Christianity there was to say, no. The person you were raised to hate, that is the person that you must love. So that's the thing morally that really sets Christianity apart. Now, of course, Christianity sprang from Judaism. And there are many ways in which you can chart a line sort of from Genesis at the beginning of the Bible right through to Revelation at the end. So we'd have to have a sort of different conversation about Judaism and Christianity versus Christianity and other global religions. But it is not necessarily the case that all religions are teaching fundamentally the same thing. Ethically, that is.
Thank you so much. Thank you for answering all of these questions. And thank you to everyone who asked questions in person and on Slido. So I think we will end the Q&A there with just another round of applause for. And I'm sure that she will also be around for a little bit after if you have questions you'd like to ask in person.
Yeah, and if you would like a copy of Confronting Christianity and they've all gone by the time you get to the table, please write your email down for somebody and I will make sure you get a copy. I've got a bunch at home. I can
Great, thank you.
make
so
sure I
much.
get into your hands.
Awesome. Yeah, going off of that, we have a bunch of copies of Confronting Christianity as well as other books out on our book table. So if you would like a book and you're a student, you can take one book per person if you haven't gotten one yet. And so yeah, make sure